I don't really care if the Cowboys win the division or not, but you got to win a playoff game, guys. Welcome in to the NFL on Fox podcast. I am your host, Dave Helman. We're officially into this weird in-between time. Roster cuts have happened. Everybody's formulating their final 53. You're seeing guys get claimed off waivers. You're seeing veteran additions at the last minute. And yet, we're still a week away from the start of the regular season, 2024 NFL season. So a little anticlimactic, if I've got to be honest, as we wait still another week for the Kansas City Chiefs to host the Baltimore Ravens. We are not going to let that slow us down. We got plenty more content coming your way. If you're not, you still have time, I promise, to subscribe to the show. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your pods, wherever you get your NFL news, you can find us there. You can find us on social at NFL on Fox Pod. Go check out the YouTube channel. If you want to comment, engage, tell us how smart or maybe not smart we are, let us know. We'll be there to engage with you as the season goes. But first, let's, again, as we go through this week, we've talked so much about news and happenings and reacting to the preseason, what we expect to see in the preseason, things of that sort. I want to pull back a little bit because it's easy to get lost in the minutia of what each team is doing at this time of year. I want to pull back a bit. Not going to call this a prediction episode, but I just want to take the time to look at the landscape, some of the more interesting teams in the NFL this year, and what we should actually expect from some of these teams, some of these very talked about, very intriguing, maybe even polarizing teams. I picked 10. It's not the 10 best. It's not the teams with the best Super Bowl odds. It's just a list of teams that I think are going to make a lot of waves for one reason or another, maybe good, maybe bad. And we're just going to go through what we expect realistically from those teams. And I am going to do it with a little bit of help. A real life friend of mine and now a friend of the show. I'm so excited to welcome on co-host of Gojo and Golic, my good buddy, Mike Golic Jr. What's up, man? How you doing?
I'm glad to be here. As I saw Cletus in the open for this, my body instantly had this visceral reaction that it's basically like smelling salts, but visually seeing the giant Fox football robot.
When you hear that theme, doesn't it? It's like primal, you know, like, can't you just envision your childhood couch, like on a Sunday afternoon when you hear that music?
I know nostalgia on Instagram is a really big part of my algorithm right now. And it's all pictures of like the last day of school before winter break. And it's the cut up stuff on the walls and snow by the bus stop. But you're right. That sound for me is getting ready to sit around with my dad on a football Sunday all day long as a kid. So it's awakened something inside me. And now I'm ready to podcast with you.
It is officially only a week and a half until we hear that music for the first time this year. Dallas Cowboys going to face the Cleveland Browns on September 8th. Two playoff teams from last year, Tom Brady's debut. You can picture it vividly. So let's get into it, Mike, right there. I just said we're going to talk about realistic expectations for some heavy hitters in the NFL this year. Who else would we start with? Especially, CeeDee Lamb got his deal earlier this week. We're hearing rumblings that maybe Dak Prescott still has time to get his contract. I believe I spoke with you about that on your program earlier this week. Let's get into it. And we'll start with none other than America's team, the Dallas Cowboys. All this noise, as always, that's what the Cowboys do. Can you help me nail down a realistic expectation for them? And I would love to hear it from you first, because this has just been my lived experience for a decade. I feel a little too close to the forest to see the trees. So I would love for you to start and tell me what you think is a realistic expectation for the Cowboys this year.
Yeah, as I sit here in my home field Notre Dame 1977 championship shirt, I can't help but wonder what you mean about being too close to a situation to accurately read it. I would never know anything about that. But no, I think for all of the business entity and entertainment product that is the Dallas Cowboys, and for the focus on their offseason in a number of ways, from not going out and meaningfully adding to the roster in a way that is never really what the Dallas Cowboys do, especially lately. I still think the bones of this team and a realistic expectation for this team, once again, is maybe not 12 wins. Maybe 12 wins every year is something that we've gone nose blind to a little bit and forgotten how difficult that is. But this should still be a double-digit win football team. This should still be a team that can win the division in the NFC East, while you've got, I think, the Giants arrow pointing down, the Commanders with a rookie quarterback and questions still on defense, and then this Philadelphia team having to basically do a full overhaul of last year. I think Dallas should still expect to win the division. And from there, I can't realistically, Dave, say, and the expectation needs to be they get to an NFC championship or anything like that, because we just have no proof that that's possible right now. But they should absolutely be capable of winning a playoff game, even with this team, even understanding it's probably not as good as last year's roster overall.
I think that last part is what it comes down to for me. And I don't really even care if the Cowboys win the division. You know, the NFC East hasn't had a repeat champion famously since the 03-04 Eagles. The Cowboys and Eagles have been swapping division championships for the last 3 years. And I think the Eagles are going to be a good team. We'll get to them in a little bit on this show. I don't really care if the Cowboys win the division or not, but you got to win a playoff game, guys. You just have to. I don't care if it's as the 5 seed and you go beat, the 4 seed like you did a couple years ago. I don't care where you are. If you're hosting because you did win the division, it really doesn't matter to me. I do think now that we've gotten closer to the season, that there was a lot of doom and gloom when you let Tyron Smith leave, when you let Dan Quinn kind of pilfer your defensive depth. He signed 3 or 4 guys away to the Commanders. It's easy to look and be like, they're not as good as last year. And that's probably true. Still a hell of a lot of good football players on this team, Mike. And I'm with you. Like, even if it's a lesser version of this team, it still feels like enough to win a playoff game. And even if they can't break that conference title game drought, the only way to keep everyone in the world from clowning on them is if they don't go over like they did last year.
Yeah, that really is. I guess, God, shame is a powerful motivator. So maybe at some point, the Dallas Cowboys, there's enough shame in that fact, because you're right. And I understand depth. You could have that conversation in a lot of areas for this team, and the areas of concern from last year, most notably the rushing attack on offense and the run defense, outside of, Mike Zimmer and structural changes. And we'll see what that nets them in terms of helping out against the run, are not demonstrably better on paper. But you still look and you've got star players like, and I understand the name game only gets you so far. It's easy for us to sit and barf out on TV, but like at the impact positions, yeah, you lack depth in the receiver room outside of it, but there's a reason you gave CeeDee Lamb all that money, because even in obvious situations, he's borderline unstoppable. Dak Prescott was the MVP runner-up for that same reason. Zach Martin's still playing at an insane level, despite the fact that we're probably in the last few years of his career. You get Diggs back on defense. Micah Parsons is an unstoppable force of nature's fury. And so all of those premier players that, yeah, like sound good names, it's not like they're guys past their prime. They're firmly in it. They play premium positions, and they all play impact enough positions to where, yeah, even outside the depth, you're better than 90% of the rest of the league. You've got rich problems for sure, but they're problems you should be able to solve.
Let me ask you this, and you played offensive line, and this just goes to show like the whiplash of life in the NFL, where you're just adapting to new information by the day. A big part of my angst with Dallas was that Tyron Smith walks to the New York Jets and Tyler Biadasz goes to Washington, and the plan is to replace those 2 guys with rookies. And I've been doing this too long to think that was going to go well. And then we get to the preseason, and maybe it's going to go just fine, because Tyler Guyton looks like a dude. Cooper Beebe looks like a dude at the center position. And all of a sudden I'm like, man, if they really did it again and restocked this offensive line in one draft class, there's no telling what they could do. But I'm also self-aware enough to realize that they're opening the season against Myles Garrett and the Cleveland Browns. So how highly do you think we should be buying into this change at offensive line here in the preseason?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a worthy reminder that especially like I know CBA talk is really unsexy, but what with me and the fact that it changed the hours so much post 2011 CBA and everything after that, how much time you could spend on the field. No position got affected by that more than offensive line, where you are doing the most technically difficult position, O line and DB, go backwards and block insane athletes using really unnatural skills and techniques. And so it takes time under task. And for a guy like Tyler Guyton specifically, who's so toolsy coming out of Oklahoma, but needs more time and ball, that's going to affect you most early. The first quarter of the NFL's regular season has essentially been dubbed an extra preseason now that we've devalued the actual one to the extent that we have. So I think that one could get ugly. Like Tyler's going to make mistakes early on. It's going to be inconsistent. I think the thing that, like you, was most heartening for me in the preseason was, one, you can tell the effect of being around Zach, being around Tyler Smith, who was a similar profile coming out of college. You see the consistent motor there. Effort is something that's non-negotiable for that group, and it shows. But also, like the arm length, the tools that were the sell for him, even while technically he's still going to get some things right and figure them out. And against a guy like Myles Garrett, you don't want to stress test the first week. You don't want the pipe stressed by a hurricane the first week of the season, but that's what you're getting. You've already seen on tape the tools bailing him out of bad situations that his technique's gotten him into. And so knowing that's there, I do think it's going to be a fun watch, even if Myles is going to win that matchup, because that's what he does against everybody.
It's going to be fun one way or the other. All right, let's try to wrap these up with a thesis statement. So we're saying Dallas Cowboys contend for the division, at least make the playoffs, and man, it would be nice to see y'all win a playoff game.
Yeah, I think you can even boil it down to a sentence. Win a playoff game. Like where you're at as an organization, win a playoff game. That really, the assignment's simple for them.
I think that's completely fair. Let's keep it pushing. We'll knock this division out in one fell swoop, if you see what I did there. The Philadelphia Eagles, the other main contender in that division. Maybe this is unfair, but based on the fact that they have recently done it, I feel like I have much higher expectations for the Philadelphia Eagles. They go 14-1 with a healthy Jalen Hurts in 22. They lose the Super Bowl by the thinnest of margins. And then they're 10-1 when the vibes just inexplicably fall apart last season. So we know the talent is here. And Mike, on top of that, I said this earlier this week, the Eagles have spent the offseason sending every indicator they can that they're going for broke. Like, they're signing Saquon Barkley. They're bringing in the two biggest names, at offensive and defensive coordinator. They went out and replaced Hassan Reddick with another premium pass rusher in Bryce Huff. They brought back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Like, hey, let's recapture the Super Bowl vibes. Who was here that year? Come on back and help us replicate that. Everything they've done suggests that they expect to make another run at the Super Bowl. I'm not going to go as far as to say the Eagles need to make the Super Bowl for this to be a successful season, but a legitimate playoff run, like playoff wins with an S, whether that's winning a wild card game and a division game to get to the NFC title game, or maybe they're even good enough to get a bye and they get back to the Super Bowl. One of those two things, with the talent on hand and all of the emphasizing that I've heard this offseason that they've put last year's woes behind them, I struggle to come up with a reason other than vibes why that can't happen. So that's kind of the standard that I'm going to hold them to.
Yeah, I think there is no substitute for having seen the ball go through the basket in that way. And I think as I look at a lot of the teams that are getting ready to make runs this year, having done it before and understanding what that takes goes a long way. I still like multiple's probably the right answer. And in plenty of places where I did the team draft with Mina Kimes on her show the other day. And part of my reasoning for picking Philadelphia was, hey, like, you've got a higher ceiling, I think, because of the way their game in particular translates to late season football, and especially in the NFC right now. Like, the premium in this conference is on being able to stop the run and being able to run it on people. And we know Philadelphia with the team that they've got, with just a little bit of window dressing. That's kind of all we asked for by the end of last year was, hey, your quarterback's leg was a little hurt. He was a little bit banged up. You just need a little bit of help instead of rolling the ball out and say, you guys have to accomplish this all on your own. So I would probably say winning a playoff game to me would be enough of a return to form to feel like for Philadelphia, the ship is righted, considering now so many of the parts now that Jason Kelsey's retired seem like they could be here for a little bit here. The talent's still going to be something that you've largely kept under wraps with the contracts. I think winning a playoff game as a baseline to me makes you feel a lot better about everything you went through at the back half of last season.
I suppose that's fair. I guess it's just hard for me to forget the dominance in terms of wins. I know they weren't always pretty, but again, like 10-1 to start last year, and then 2022 speaks for itself. Like we just haven't seen very many teams have an answer for the Eagles when everything's good and when everything's clicking. I mean, I get losing Jason Kelsey is an underrated loss. Obviously, I don't know that people are talking enough about that. Still not convinced that the Eagles have solved their issues at linebacker. We'll see what the secondary looks like with all their youth back there. Like I said, I think I'm still just hung up on how high the highs can be for this team. So bare minimum, I'll meet you there and just say I think the Eagles need to be part of divisional weekend. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I would say that's totally fair. And the defense probably is my hang up, right? Like they tried. And I think that's the biggest difference in a lot of people's mind between them and the Cowboys this offseason is like, it's the Simpsons meme. Well, you tried. Like at the very least, the Eagles can look at their fan base and say, we looked at every one of our deficiencies and we added bodies there. They might not be the best bodies. They might be young and growing into what they'll eventually be, but we tried.
I do the two disparate approaches of like Philly just throwing resources at the problem and Dallas saying like, well, maybe what's already here will be good enough. I can't wait to see which one of those works out better. All right. Those two pretty straightforward, I would say. I think it's pretty easy to pinpoint that. I'm going to throw you a curveball here and get to our first team where I don't know where people fall on the spectrum here. And that's the New York Jets. Which it speaks for itself. I mean, the star power of Aaron Rodgers, the size of the market. I feel like it's a recipe for people to get carried away, but see if you follow me on this take. Because I know it's tempting to hold the Jets to this crazy standard because of the ride that they've put us on since they traded for Aaron Rodgers. And even last year when he's recovering from an Achilles injury, like we're having to hear about whether or not he's going to play. I get it. It's been kind of exhausting. I still don't think it's fair to hold the Jets to any kind of like Super Bowl standard. Like this is still an organization that hasn't been to the playoffs since 2010, a head coach and a general manager that we can't definitively say have done a good job to this point, and a roster that, as promising as it looks, like has a lot that could go wrong. Aaron is 40 coming off an Achilles tear. The offensive line has talent on it, but those guys have a history of getting hurt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I really just want the Jets to make the playoffs. I think that would be a successful season. And I would love to know if you think I'm being too lenient with that.
No, like, so this is interesting because you took the words right out of my mouth. Is if the Jets make the playoffs, that's a win relative to that expectation. The problem is, like, that's not what you did any of this for. And so if the Jets come out of the 2 years of the Aaron Rodgers experience with a playoff appearance and that's it, then that's a massive failure. And so, yeah, the realistic expectation is with all of the things that you mentioned hanging in the balance and the fact that it's the bleeping Jets, make the playoffs is more than a reasonable expectation.
I'm going to get real unhinged with it. But just follow me here. Just follow me down this path. Aaron Rodgers plays well. The offensive line stays healthy. The defense, even not knowing what's going on with Hassan Reddick, the defense does its thing. Let's say the Jets do make the playoffs. They don't even win their division, but they just get there. They go 0-1, whatever, but they win 10 or 11 games and they get to the playoffs. Aaron Rodgers is technically under contract next year. And what if that season inspires Aaron, hey, I'm coming back. I feel great. I'm in the best shape of my life. Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas keep their jobs. And now we can really push chips in on 2025. I know I just took like 18 leaps in logic, but I can at least see it. Like, I don't think it all has to hinge on this year. And maybe that's why it's easier for me to tamper my expectations a little bit.
I would say that is an incredibly reasonable approach for an organization that has just felt so volatile. Like in normal circumstances, again, if we were building this thing holistically, what you just described should be the absolute order of events, right? You bring in a bunch of the necessary pieces, you give them a year to work it out. Your goal, like honestly, I keep coming back to make the playoffs to me is like just play with a clean sheet. No catastrophic injuries involved for this team this year. No major off the field dilemmas that distract in any way. And then you go through and you get to next offseason. Aaron plans his vacation to somewhere else. And this time you don't have it become a big media snafu. You just move minicamp and call it a day. And then you can ride into that season with the benefit of now just forgetting the hype beast that's built up around this team, actual results to point back to, because that's the other part. If you get Aaron Rodgers playing, let's say, even better than the last time we saw him for a full season in 2022, you get more close. You don't get quite MVP Aaron Rodgers, but it's somewhere in between that and 2022. That in the New York market with that quality of team is a beacon for like the kind of roster that would attract veterans looking to latch on to a team for maybe a little less, especially given that place.
Is it even remotely reasonable to expect that much sanity from the New York Jets and Aaron Rodgers?
Oh God. I mean, we are just jamming the two same ends of the magnet together, trying to force it to stay in one piece when it just wants to push apart. That is the natural state of things for the Jets.
Okay, so, and I guess I'm putting you on the spot, but if we assume that this is their last great chance, and maybe it's not, but let's just assume if we're just focused on this year, realistic, and I hear you, and I think it's a good point that you didn't trade for Aaron Rodgers to lose one playoff game, but what do you think is a realistic expectation for the Jets?
I mean, if it all were to hit like absolutely right and the O-line comes together and does all that, like that's a team I wouldn't be stunned with that quarterback. Like again, assuming I won't even give you MVP Aaron Rodgers. But if the rest of it hits right and the defense is kind of a stable stock again, even with the parts that they've lost or moved, like the Hassan Reddick thing notwithstanding, I wouldn't be shocked if they made the AFC Championship game. That wouldn't stun me completely.
I think this is look, I get it. I think people have Aaron Rodgers fatigue, but they just might be the most interesting team in the league in terms of the array of outcomes. Like if you tell me this is a 6-win team because everything went to hell, absolutely. If you tell me this is a 12-win team that got to the AFC title game, I can see it too. I will settle New York Jets for getting to the playoffs. I don't think that's asking too much if everything goes well. We'll stick in the AFC East. I can hear Buffalo Bills fans bristling, like the team that's owned this division. It's just like, hey, what about us? Like everybody's writing us off, which I think is totally fair. And I am a buyer on the Buffalo Bills. I mean, I just said they've won the division 4 straight times. They also, I think people sleep on this. They have the second longest streak of double-digit win seasons. Only the Chiefs are cranking out big time, winning records better than the Buffalo Bills. And I would hope the Bills and their fans are not content to accept this narrative that they are taking a back seat. Like I would hope Bills fans, even knowing that Stephon Diggs is gone and the defense is going to need contributions from a few unsung names, even with all that in mind, I would hope Bills fans expect to win the AFC East. I don't think that's a crazy ask.
No, I mean, if you're talking about expectation for this team, it should be make the AFC Championship. I don't think that's crazy. Like not with the foundation they've got. I get it. Like, hey, you mentioned some of the, unknowns on defense, but offensively, you're going to need a young receiver room to step up. You're going to need Keon Coleman to be more than just an incredible soundbite. He's going to have to go out there and be very productive in an offense that's going to major in the middle of the field to start. But I don't know, man. Seeing that get rolling down the back half of last season, that was the most dangerous team in football for the last half of the NFL season. And they did it behind a ground game, behind a defense that had lost a lot of its aging veteran parts, the ones that are gone to injury. Matt Milano was gone, much like he is now to start the season for Buffalo. And so we're not going to watch them do anything they haven't really done already. They're going to have, another offseason where D coordinators and O coordinators are going to have seen all that, but they're built the right way in the trenches, and they've got one of the super weapons at quarterback.
I'm gonna say, I think obviously this is just one of those teams where if Josh Allen's healthy and doing his thing, I can't write off any ceiling for the Buffalo Bills, and I get it. Patrick Mahomes and even Joe Burrow have been an obstacle for them in the playoffs, but if Josh Allen's healthy, I think this is always going to be on the team of the short list of teams you don't want to see coming up on the schedule in January.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest question mark for them is especially going to be in the safety room right now. Like, you look up at what they lost there, and now like Taylor Rapp and DeMar Hamlin is the names that you're going to have to count on for a defense that already got beat deep a bunch last year. Doesn't make me sleep well at night. But you talk about the Bengals as I think the other team, like the Chiefs are going to be there. They're my Super Bowl pick. I'll save that for everyone until further notice, world without end, amen. But I think for Buffalo, Cincinnati, Baltimore, that range of teams, I'm also kind of thinking ahead of how they match up. And man, for Cincinnati, like that defense was really bad against the ground game last year. And I understand you reorganize the safety room there, and that top-down approach might allow everyone to play better and tackle better than they did last season with the group up front. But man, you're going to have to prove it against a group in Buffalo that's got the benefit of a bunch of continuity and dudes that can make that work. And that's before you start talking about the quarterback as a part of that.
Here's one thing I'll say for the Bills. I went back and looked at this just to make sure I was remembering it right. But like even, last year they stole the division from the Dolphins on the last day and it bumped them up into the 2 seed. This has been a team that's been flirting with that 2 seed territory for most of Josh Allen's run. Like I said, they're winning 11, 12 games, occasionally 13. I do wonder if this is the year that they're like the 4 seed in the AFC playoffs. Like maybe it's only 10 wins this year, or maybe it's 11, but 11 isn't good enough to get you the 2 seed this year. I could see that just because they do need so many guys to step up. I don't think the roster is quite as talented as it was for a couple of those seasons in the past. But even if that's the case, the makeup, the consistency, the talent of the quarterback, the experience doing it, even if they have a lesser record and even if they have to fight a little bit harder, it's realistic to say that you just can't write them off in the postseason. I think they've earned that respect.
Yeah, they make it really simple. Like last year, according to FTN, offensive line was 3rd in adjusted line yards, lowest adjusted sack rate in the NFL. Defense, 6th in pass DVOA when they rushed 4 guys. Like they can do the easy thing we always talk about, like hand the ball off and hurt you with a competent group and rush 4 on defense and help out all those other guys. Now, obviously, Von Miller, going down and not being effective last year, you didn't get as much of it from the edge, but Ed Oliver, one of those legitimate dudes on the interior that changes the game down the spine in the way we love talking about now, especially post Baltimore last year. So I just think they can make the game remarkably simple, to your point, so that when you're standing there at the end of the season and the game tends to get simple, they're ready.
Buffalo Bills, you've just entered that territory where winning the division, no matter what, feels realistic, and go with God when we get to the postseason. Maybe you'll break through one of these years. All right. I mentioned the Jets as being one of the most interesting teams for a variety of reasons. The next one, you got to throw them in there. Let's talk about the Chicago Bears. And this is actually, this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I've been filling in on FS1 frequently in the summer, and whenever we have these conversations about Caleb Williams, and of course, he's such a flashpoint player. Everybody wants to know how he's going to do. Is he going to live up to the hype? And I've been reluctant to put postseason expectations on Caleb Williams because I don't think it's fair. Even for a guy with as much hype as he's had, I don't think it's fair to just put this guy into the playoffs from day one. So I go on FS1 and I say, I just want Caleb Williams to prove he's the guy, set some franchise milestones, flirt with 4,000 yards, look like the real deal. And that's all I need. And James Jones, friend and co-host, former wonderful Packers receiver, he looked at me and he goes, Dave, if Caleb does all of that, don't you think the wins are going to follow? And don't you think the Bears will be in the playoff conversation? And I didn't really have an answer for him, Mike, because I think he's right. Like, if Caleb Williams is what I think he is, then I'm not saying the Bears are going to make a run, but they are at least a team you have to take seriously as a playoff team.
Yeah, I think being in the conversation is probably the right answer to that, right? I think you said it there at the end. I don't expect them to be a playoff team. And listen, part of that is going to be growing pains for Caleb and all these new weapons on offense. We saw some of the same stuff in the preseason we did in college, right? There are still spots where the ball's not coming out quick enough, where you see his size show up a little bit, and they're going to have to find workarounds for that in the offense. And he's going to have to get more comfortable, but they've got the dudes to do it. It's, can they do that while also, if the defense isn't as turnover frisky as they were when they made that run post Montez Sweat acquisition in the back half of that season, then can you weather that storm in the same way? But if they're in the conversation, that is good enough. And honestly, if Caleb Williams finishes the season upright, like if we're not talking about a rookie quarterback that has to rehab, and I understand, like we could say that for damn near everybody, but I think especially for these rookies who are coming in where offensive line is one of the positions, we still say, hey, if you're asking questions about the Bears offense, they start up front with, can they be consistently good enough to keep a guy clean who's still good at getting away and mitigating sacks? That to me feels like the baseline for success. Are you in the conversation? And does Caleb Williams get to begin the next offseason in the classroom and not in the training room?
Please, God, of course we want as many people to finish the season as possible, but a prospect with this much expectation and excitement for sure. Yeah. I mean, the Bears haven't had a winning record since 2018. They haven't even won 8 games since 2020. It's been a pretty brutal 3 years. If they even flirt with 500, maybe a winning record, potentially playoffs. That's as far as I can go. I can't say I expect them in the postseason, but 8-9 or even 9-8, but the last team out of the playoff field, I think that feels about right for realism.
8-9 and like split with the Vikings and get at least one win against the division powerhouses in Green Bay and Detroit.
Oh, if they go up to Lambeau and beat the Packers, like that would sustain, like that would light Chicago as a city. Like the energy from that win could just keep the lights on in Chicago for the rest of the offseason. So yeah, I think that's a key distinction, is like flirt with 500, beat a big boy or two, preferably a division rival. And I think we're feeling okay in the Chicagoland area. Speaking of the Green Bay Packers, we're going division to division. Let's just stick to an equal. Can you imagine how, and not to say people aren't excited about the Packers, but it is very impressive that the Chicago Bears have stolen so much oxygen in this division just because of Caleb. Meanwhile, the Packers you could call them a Super Bowl contender, and I don't think that's crazy. So let's nail down, again, a realistic expectation, because you always want the young, exciting team to build on what they did last year. And we go into this assuming the Packers are just going to immediately look like that team that couldn't lose in the back end of the season, push the 49ers to the brink. I don't know if that's completely fair, but I do want to see Green Bay build on last year. Like, you look at, they changed their defensive coordinator finally. I think Packers fans would say that was a year or two too late, but at least they did it. You add Josh Jacobs to an offense that already had a lot of talent, and you assume, based on the contract, that Jordan Love is going to continue to ascend. I certainly do. It's got to be 10 wins minimum, right? 10 wins minimum is like what's going to make you feel good about this season if you're a Green Bay Packer fan.
Yeah, 10 wins minimum and them pushing the Lions for the division. I don't like, again, we expect them to be them making the playoffs again seems like the floor now with what we saw put on tape by this team. I mean, they pushed San Francisco to the brink. That should have been a Green Bay win on the road in the postseason against the team that's been the perennial NFC representative in the playoffs. So making the postseason's a baseline, but pushing the Lions every step of the way to actually win that division, considering the fact that, The Lions are the poster child of stability now. They've built this thing brick and mortar from the ground up. They locked up all their key pieces on offense by and large. Defensively, they've added some youth in places along the line and in the secondary, and they've done it so slowly that you can count on it to be there. But with the Packers, you've got the thing that we all chase in this league is you've got infinitely more upside at the quarterback position. Jared Goff's a great stable veteran who can throw through a keyhole on play action over the middle of the field, but you get him under a little bit of pressure, and that's when things get interesting. Jordan Love's got that game breaker ability. And so if you can tap into more of that back half of the season with a roster that, yeah, overall, unless the defense takes a huge step under Halfley, probably isn't going to be ready to meet them blow for blow, especially on the lines of scrimmage. I do think that as the X factor means, yeah, you can realistically expect a challenge for the North this year.
I do think the Lions are the fly in the ointment for figuring out the Packers. Because newsflash, Lions fans, you're not going to hear your name on this podcast. That's not because I don't respect you. I know what to expect, and that's Super Bowl. I have very high expectations for the Detroit Lions. I think they're a Super Bowl contender. They should flirt with being the 1 seed in the NFC, honestly. That is what I expect. And so it's not to say that the Lions aren't good. I just know what the expectations are there. That makes it for a very interesting conversation with Green Bay, where much like the Cowboys, I could see them winning 10, 11, 12 games and being a wild card team. So I hear you. Pushing for the division would certainly be great, but even if Green Bay is a 12-win wild card, that's more than good enough for me, especially because we already know they can go on the road and be a problem in the playoffs with this roster.
Yeah, show that you live here now. Show that the playoffs, like, again, even for yet another, I know we've done that they can't keep getting away with this thing at quarterback over and over again, but just show that, like, hey, for all that stuff Aaron Rodgers used to say about, owning the Bears and his dominance in that division, that while, yes, it belongs to the Lions right now, and you're right, the answer is 2 words for them in Super Bowl. This should be a team that just reminds people, like, hey, we're doing it again. We're going to be in the playoffs every year. And now once this group that's still amongst the youngest skill players and youngest rosters in the NFL on offense continues to get seasoning together, we're going to be a nightmare for you guys until further notice.
I just said we weren't going to talk about the Lions because of their Super Bowl expectations. I am going to talk about the other heavyweight in the NFC, and that's the San Francisco 49ers, just because I'm not sure there should be a fan base with more angst right now than San Francisco 49er fans. Because it's not just that you have to get to the Super Bowl, you have to win it. And it's not just that you have to win it, it's that, like, I can see, it's like Indiana Jones where the door's closing and you're reaching back for the hat. Like, I can see the door closing on your hand right now as you're reaching back. Like, as we're recording this, Brandon Ayuk is still not at practice. Trent Williams is probably waiting for Brandon Ayuk's situation to get sorted out. The vibes don't feel great in the Bay, and that's for a season where you already know what it's going to take to meet the expectations. So I do think that's a really interesting place. I don't think there is a single team in the league where losing the Super Bowl would be seen as a failure. Even the Chiefs, like, of course you want to win the Super Bowl, but even the Chiefs have several trophies to keep them warm at night if that's what happens. The Niners, it really feels like now or never with this group of players to me, or am I being too dramatic?
No, I mean, it would be Buffalo Bills-esque, right? In terms of, like, going to all of them and losing all of them and the sting that leaves on a franchise. And listen, we know the 49ers, right? Plenty of history there, plenty of trophies in their cupboard as well. But you would be looking at ultimately one of the most talented rosters over a run of years we've seen in quite some time that would have fallen short. It would be a failure. And I understand, like, we've heard plenty of guys, I think of the Giannis quote all the time where he talks about a season being a failure and that binary presented. But man, I bet if you got an honest answer from a lot of the people in that organization, they would say the same thing. Like, yeah, the friends we made along the way, the relationships, all that stuff matters in sports a lot more than we want to give it credit for. But in terms of potential and what you should have been able to do, yeah, losing the Super Bowl would be an abject disaster for this team, because we know everything changes next year. And it's not to say it changes for the worse necessarily, but it changes a lot in a way you've got to show us you're going to be able to weather.
Yeah, the Bills are such a great parallel because, yeah, I mean, we still view them as a team that you have to take seriously, but we just talked about how it's going to be harder for them. You lose pieces, veterans leave, financial decisions have to be made. It felt like it was never going to come, but we're looking at it right now where the 49ers are having to start making these choices. We don't know for sure right now that Brandon Ayuk is going to play for this team in 2024, which is insane, by the way. I would have bet my life that we would have the answer to this Brandon Ayuk thing by roster cut down day, and it just hasn't materialized. On top of that, like we know Purdy is going to be in line for a huge contract next year. We know that some of these players are very veteran players. Hitting on so many cheap quarterbacks has allowed them to build this Avengers team. And I just feel like you're going to start losing infinity stones here starting in 2025. And that's why this just feels so urgent to me and why I wanted to talk about it.
Think about Brandon Ayuk too, man. The guy was started off in Shanny's doghouse, worked his way out and became like the highest level Shanahan receiver that we had seen in San Francisco, does all the things he likes, active blocker, exists outside of the system, only to now work his way, even if he comes back, I'd imagine firmly in the I mean, we all turned into DAP analysts when he was at practice that one day, walking around, going up to John Lynch and Shanahan and doing all that.
What, was that a goodbye handshake or a like congratulations handshake?
Well, honestly, it was warmer reception from Kyle than it was from John. The John handshake, the DAP there was, yeah, I don't really want to talk to you right now. The Kyle DAP was the very least, oh man, like it'd be nice to see you back out here. But yeah, anything is on the table for all of them. It's just amazing how that arc has kind of gotten back to the beginning where all of a sudden the guy that became everything they wanted him to, that struggled out of the gate, now is the one that can't get paid.
Which I was writing about this earlier this week too, is up until I would say as recently as May, I was like, people aren't talking about Brandon Ayuk enough. Like, why don't we respect Brandon Ayuk? Why don't people recognize him as a huge piece of this? And here we are getting close to September, and I'm just like, I don't know how much more I can talk about Brandon Ayuk.
I know it's kind of obscure though. You talked about the clock ticking. Like we talk about this in terms of the Brock Purdy contract all the time. Christian McCaffrey's getting towards 30 and starting the season off with a bit of a calf tweak right now. George Kittle's 30 years old and plays an incredibly physical brand of football. Trent Williams is 36. Like forget the contract situation. That's a guy also like all of these guys have been so good for so long. You know, Fred Warner on the other side, Nick Bosa. These players deserve is a loaded word. It's a made up fairy tale word, but man, it'd be awesome to see a group that's this incredible and has this many uniquely gifted players be able to get this before all of a sudden they start to get into the back half of their careers.
The crazy thing is they could get Ayuk into camp. They could get Trent's deal done and they could start 6-0. And it wouldn't lessen. I mean, it's totally plausible. It wouldn't lessen my anxiety, though, because, again, that's how high the stakes are, where if you're not holding the trophy, I don't see how this was a successful season. It's a testament to what a team they have built. Oh, but, man, it gives me anxiety thinking about navigating all of that. Best of luck to the 49ers. All right. We've been doing several teams with lofty playoff-type expectations. So I want to throw you a true curveball now. Fox entrusts me with weekly power rankings. And like, you know, I made one at the start of training camp just based on like, how did your draft go? How did your off season go? I went back and looked. 6 weeks ago, I had the Denver Broncos 31st in the league in terms of what I expected from them. And here we are about to start the season. Bo Nix goes out there. He goes 21 of 30 for 200 yards and a couple touchdowns. I know it's the preseason, but dude grabbed the starting job and ran with it. You look at this roster. I don't think it's the best roster in the NFL by any stretch, but maybe it's a little bit better than people give it credit for. And on top of that, obviously, I don't think it's realistic to think the Broncos are going to catch the Chiefs. I don't think even like the most diehard Denver fans, like even the people wearing no shirt in the snow at 0 altitude in January or at a mile altitude in January, don't believe that. But I do think the Denver Broncos could be the second best team in the AFC West. And I don't know that I believed that 6 weeks ago, Mike.
Yeah, you've got a fascinating array of others in that division outside of Kansas City, right? Because the Chiefs are going to win that going away. But you look,
such an interesting collection of teams in the AFC West.
you've got every possibility, right? You've got a rookie that honestly feels like stable, like in a way with Gardner Minshew and the Raiders, they've got a ton of weapons, big names on that team, and a quarterback in Gardner Minshew that I think we're going to see this year was the beneficiary of a decent amount of help from Shane Steichen last year that might not turn out the same way and is clearly the placeholder to get them to where they're going next season with whatever quarterback's going to be the guy of the future there. You've got Bo Nix that feels incredibly stable, and then you've got Justin Herbert, who's the second best quarterback to Mahomes in this division, but is on a team that we know sawed off its arm in the form of all the skill position players on the offense and a defense that's got to really show us it can stay healthy on the field long enough to be good in a new system under Jesse Minter. So yeah, I don't think what you laid out in terms of the Broncos being the second best team in the division is inaccessible to them. I'd probably still say I would roll the dice with one of the other two before I'd say that, but I don't think, let's put it this way, however it shakes out, I don't think they're going to be the worst team in the division when it comes to the end of this year.
I think that maybe that's why I wanted to talk about them is I at one point felt confident that would be the case because you laid it out. The Raiders have a surprisingly nice roster. They just don't really have a quarterback. The Chargers have an amazing quarterback and not really a ton else worth getting excited about. The Broncos, I just don't think we know anything other than that Bo Nix is now going to start for them. And I'm doing my best not to get too excited about preseason games, but he looks more ready to go than I gave him credit for. I guess that shouldn't be surprising. The guy started enough games in college, but if he's good, I'm at least going to say what I think we had it on the screen a minute ago. If the over under is 5.5 wins, I think good Bo Nix can get the Broncos over that total with a big assist from Sean Payton.
Yeah, I was going to say the Sean Payton portion of this, I think that's what will come out of this season, having either a deeper appreciation for or more questions for, is the Sean Payton, Drew Brees combination. For years, people have done like a pseudo Bill Belichick and Tom Brady with that at times of how much one affects the other in terms of the overall success that they both enjoyed and what they meant for that city that is, impossible to describe to people that weren't around there for it. But I do think seeing that, I mean, he already earned a lot of respect with what he did, getting that kind of season out of Russell Wilson last year after the debacle that was 2022. So, still some questions about the overall talent on defense. We know they're not 700 yards and 70 points bad and weren't for the lion's share of last season once a few guys got back. But I am cautiously optimistic because at the end of the day, you can hand the ball off an awful lot, and you've got a quarterback that kind of like Brock Purdy comes in and doesn't seem like he's going to be super rattled, even if I have questions about what his physical gifts are capable of on the top end.
More than anything, my takeaway from this segment is that I think if we could build a Frankenstein's monster team out of the 3 non-Chiefs teams in the AFC West, I think you could push for a Super Bowl. Because if you had Herbert with the Chargers O-line throwing to Devontae Adams and Cortland Sutton with like Crosby and Christian Wilkins, you got Pat Surtain on the back end representing the Broncos. Like, that's a nice team. They just, unfortunately, they don't get to combine rosters, I'm afraid.
If the Chiefs win 3 straight, we should allow the rest of the AFC West to do that. That should be at the owners' meetings in the offseason, and the competition committee should present that proposal.
AFC West teams can grab substitutes from their division rivals when they play the Kansas City Chiefs. Voted on in February. We talked about the Packers, the ascending team, the Super Bowl contender that we were not talking about all last year. That would be the Houston Texans in the AFC. It's so like this is why I think it's great to talk about realistic expectations, because this is a team everybody saw as bottom 10 a year ago, and now they are a trendy Super Bowl pick. I think the difference between the Texans and the Packers is mainly just the division that they play in. Not to say that the Jaguars aren't good, or, we'll see what the Titans and the Colts can be, but I think everybody would agree this is an infinitely more winnable division than the NFC North. So my thing for the Houston Texans, Mike, I'm not worried about Super Bowl. I'm not worried about any of that. I just finally want somebody in the AFC South to grab that division and own it. And with the roster that Houston's put together, it can be them. Because, I looked this up. Like, the AFC South, the Titans in 2021 were the 1 seed in the AFC at 12-5. Other than that, you got to look hard for a team that won 12 or more games. Like the 2012 Texans did it. And then obviously way before that, Peyton Manning's Colts owned the division for a long time. But for most of the last decade, we're just talking about trading 9-8 records, winning the division with 10 wins, squeaking in by a game. Like, it's a cliche at this point. Write the AFC South champion in as the 4 seed and put them on at 3:00 on Saturday afternoon in the wild card round of the playoffs. Like, that's what we do with this division. A realistic expectation for Houston is to just be better than that. Win 12 or more games, flirt with the number 1 seed in the AFC. I'll worry about the playoffs after that. But if you can do that, I think it is a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah, I would agree. Consistency. Like, I think for them in Green Bay, I think that's the roundabout way and the way we're trying to dress up what we want to see, which is the consistency that these two quarterbacks appear primed to give us. For this Houston team, too, a lot of that involves like, hey, you've got to become more multidimensional. The Joe Mixon pickup looms very large right now. That O-line, however they reshuffle the interior, has to be better and afford you more, because as great as CJ Stroud is, I have a feeling if that run game doesn't develop, defensive coordinators in this league are too good to let them get away with it the same way they did last year, not having any semblance of a ground game for so much of the season. But I'm with you. Become the face of this division, and I think win a playoff game again. Like, I don't think that's an unrealistic standard to say they're a team I expect to win a playoff game again. They've got the talent to be a team that challenges for further than that in the postseason, but with all of the youth and with questions about how multidimensional they can be, I still think win a playoff game is a realistic a goal again for this season.
It makes me uneasy, and I'm right there with everybody else. Like, I have high hopes, big expectations for CJ Stroud and Jordan Love, but it makes me uneasy how that is just assumed, like rarely, unless you're Patrick Mahomes, rarely is the NFL that easy that it just moves in a linear, in a line straight up. And I'm nervous I want that to happen. I love watching these guys. I hope it continues to go that way, but I've done this enough times to know it's not always like that. That's why before I start worrying about the Super Bowl, yeah, can we dominate the division? Can we win 11 or 12 games instead of 9 or 10? I think that's a nice place to start.
I mean, it is hilarious though how quickly they've turned this around to the point where they just cut, like the Commanders just picked up Noah Brown, who had over 500 yards receiving for them last year, because that room has now become such an embarrassment of riches with Stephon Diggs coming over and a healthy Tank Dell and Nico Collins becoming a true number 1 in the league. It's just, it really, to your point, it makes us uneasy because it almost diminishes how amazing it is already that they exist at this level of competence, considering what they were in our minds this time a year ago.
It's hard to find like a true problem spot. I guess, Danico Autry got suspended. That's a bummer, but they beefed up the linebacker core. Daniil Hunter's there, which I was worried about them losing Jonathan Grenard. They replace him with Daniil Hunter. That's a nice little swap. Derek Stingley looks like a guy that's poised to be a top 10 type of cornerback. Laramie Tunsil's still at left tackle. You already talked about the receiver core. Like, if CJ Stroud is the guy we think he is, there's not a good reason why this shouldn't happen. And like I said, that's what makes me so nervous.
Yep, it is. I feel like we've said this about a lot of teams right now, but CJ Stroud has also reached that sort of darling status where he's the quarterback that matches ability with this desire, kind of like Josh Allen, to let us in and to be able to play the game off the field as well as he does on the field. So I think that's made him a guy that's pretty easy to root for everybody involved, and thus complicates the picture even further.
Let's wrap this up with a team that occasionally has high expectations, and bad things tend to happen when those come around. That would be the Atlanta Falcons, which actually, can I tell you, again, going back to what I was saying with Denver, like 6 weeks of preseason can change your mind, because I was not bought in on Atlanta at all. I did not like the lack of activity on defense. You got to at least be mildly concerned about Kirk Cousins coming back from his own Achilles tear, which happened later than Aaron Rodgers. But then you get busy in the front office over the course of the summer, and now Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons are here. It's crazy. Like, They signed Justin Simmons, and even if he's not quite the player he was 3 years ago, Justin Simmons, Jesse Bates, AJ Terrell in the same secondary. It's the classic cliche of like, baby, you got a stew going. And now you got Matthew Judon, who at least, him and Grady Jarrett at least gives you like a semblance of an NFL pass rush. Not trying to convince anybody it's scary. But a month ago, I wasn't sold on this team. And now I'm like, yeah, I think it's realistic that you win one of the weaker divisions in the NFL.
Yeah. Completely agree. Like saying win the NFC South is not like we've set the bar unreasonably high for anybody by any stretch in the imagination. And I know this preseason, the way we've discussed it, there's been a fair amount of Bucks erasure in a way that for the team that won the division last year, made some interesting moves, re-signed Baker, brought in, a replacement for Dave Canales and Liam Cohen that I think is a really interesting coordinator hire. For this Falcons team with the collection of talent, yeah, that is an absolutely reasonable expectation. And you're right. Like, I don't know. I have a certain amount of joy. And I think someone said this last year, it might've been Mina, that looking when you had, other veteran parts for Grady Jarrett to look around and see on the field that he can trust, like having that, especially in the front seven with Matthew Judon right now. Raheem Morris comes over. This is his side of the ball and his baby that he's got to go and cook in a way that didn't last year for this Falcons team. But yeah, that works.
Here's a take that I don't have the guts to follow through on it.
Okay.
But if you listen to the pod, like I'm high on Tampa Bay as well. I think it's realistic to expect the Bucks to win the division. I don't think it's insane that the NFC South has 2 playoff teams this year. I don't think it's insane to think both of those teams could be good enough to make it, because I do think they both improved this offseason. But like I said, am I bold enough to like put that in writing? I don't think so. I think basically it comes down to the idea that I'm reluctant to choose between these two teams, because I see a lot to be excited about with both of them. Not really in terms of winning the Super Bowl. That would very much surprise me. I think that's unrealistic. But I think Tampa Bay and Atlanta are both teams that should have realistic hopes of reaching the playoffs this year.
I mean, I think the biggest feather in their cap on that is probably just the fact that the schedules are so easy. And part of that is, hey, you're playing, a game against 2 games against every other team in the NFC South, which most people don't look at, but almost all their schedules near the bottom of the league, if not rock bottom in terms of preseason difficulty, according to like FTN and the people that are looking at more than just the prior year's record. So I think from that standpoint, that take is too rich for my taste. Looking around at the rest of the NFC, we're like, we didn't talk a lot outside of San Francisco about the rest of the NFC West that I think is fascinating, all the way down to the Arizona Cardinals, who defensively still scary, but offensively that could be a pretty fun unit this year. In the NFC North, we didn't talk about Minnesota, where we get the true Sam Darnold test this year, and that could be a complicating factor with how good that offense is and Brian Flores' defense. So there's enough teams in the NFC that would keep me from saying the South is a 2-team division, but you're right in that Tampa Bay deserves our respect. And if things, again, kind of like we talked about with the Jets, there's a lot of mirrors for that. That Atlanta offense is immensely talented and has an offensive line that, by the way, doesn't have to microwave a bunch of guys together at once. That group's been together for a while and playing really competent football. So I actually worry less about the protection in some ways for Kirk Cousins than I do for Aaron Rodgers, especially at the beginning of the year.
That's a really good point. Yeah. And you plug two quality players, Judon and Simmons. You plug those 2 guys into units that have been together. And I say this a lot about Houston. I'll throw it in for Atlanta as well. We write these narratives based on the playoff games that we remember. And Tampa had a fantastic run, but we forget that Atlanta was in pole position to win the NFC South around the holidays last year, and they just spit the bit. And that was with Desmond Ridder. So if Kirk Cousins is healthy and ready to go, or even if Michael Penix can give you something, I don't think it's unrealistic at all to think that they finally get back over the hump. Falcons haven't been to the playoffs since 2016. One way or another, I think that's got to change this year for this season not to be a disappointment.
Tampa Bay, for what it's worth, and all the glowing things we've said about the parts involved, what they did offensively last year in the Baker Mayfield Renaissance season is not super sustainable unless they get a lot better. Like, they were a really bad first and second down team that led the league in third down DVOA and looked really good and was able to get themselves out of trouble because you had a quarterback that was getting back into form, was in one place long enough to feel good about it again, and had the weapons. But normally being in, I think they averaged 6.9 yards to go on third down, not where you want to be, 10th worst in the league in that game in and game out.
In less than a week, we won't have to speculate about this anymore, Mike. I mean, I love talking to you, but I can't wait for some new data. We'll figure out where this season goes. That's it for the show. It's 10 key teams. If you didn't hear your team, it's not because we don't believe, or not because they're not going to make some noise this year. But I do think the story of the season is going to have a lot to do with these teams that we highlighted. Mike Golic Jr., thank you so much for hopping on the show. Like I said at the top, if you're not following at NFL on Fox Pod, if you're not subscribed on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, please do that. Mike, I appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me, buddy. Appreciate it.
All right, that does it. We will be back in your ears, and it will be game week. It will be time to preview Kansas City Chiefs and Baltimore Ravens. Yeah, we're going to preview this coming NFL season. We're going to talk about awards. We're going to talk about playoffs. We're going to predict the Super Bowl, all that good stuff. That is coming next week. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to kickoff. Can't wait. I appreciate it. I will talk to y'all soon.